Good afternoon. I'm thrilled to welcome you to Neuroscience and Diversity, Equity and Inclusion in Education, Promises and Challenges, a seminar sponsored by the Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience program. My name is Pamela Smith, and I'm director of the Center for Science and Society. If you haven't attended any of our previous events, I want to say just a few words about the Presidential Scholars Program and the Center for Science and Society. The Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience facilitates cross-disciplinary collaborative research to advance our understanding of mind, brain, and behavior, bringing together talented early career scholars from various fields with faculty experts in neuroscience and in the humanities, arts, and social sciences. The program has developed a new paradigm for original integrative research and training. The program supports early postdoctoral scholars, seed funding for cross-disciplinary research, and various seminars, conferences, and other events. The Center for Science and Society, which manages the Presidential Scholars Program, is a hub for researchers, scholars, and practitioners seeking to break down traditional disciplinary silos and enhance public understanding of science. This is our last PSSN event for the semester, but please visit our website and sign up for our newsletter to receive information about our fall schedule. Follow us on social media for the latest updates about our activities. You can participate in today's discussion at any time using the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. The moderator will share your questions during the Q&A period. The PSSN program would not be possible without support of leadership at Columbia, including President Lee Bollinger and our valued steering committee members, Peter Berman, Michael Goldberg, Carol Mason, Valerie Purdie-Greenaway, and Christopher Peacock. Faculty from across the university participate on the advisory committee, mentor our scholars, and volunteer to review and interview applicants. Thanks to all of you who have helped make this program an example of interdisciplinary achievement. We will be providing ways to keep in touch in the chat box throughout the event today. Now I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Valerie Purdie-Greenaway. Valerie Purdie-Greenaway is an associate professor of psychology at Columbia University and director of the Laboratory of Intergroup Relations and the Social Mind. Dr. Purdie-Greenaway's research focuses on how stereotypes about women, ethnic minorities, and other diverse groups undermine high performance. Her work has been featured in numerous scientific and media publications, including Science, Psychological Science, the New York Times, and Scientific American. I'm very happy to give the floor now to Dr. Purdie-Greenaway.
Thank you so much, Pamela. I am absolutely delighted to be here. So welcome, everyone. I'm thrilled and honored to facilitate this conversation. And so just to sort of get us started, the title of this conversation is Neuroscience and Diversity, Equity and Inclusion in Education, Promises and Challenges. And this is an interesting title because it's rare that each of these concepts are integrated together. So I want to take a moment to share how this panel came together. Neuroscience cuts across many disciplines and is a powerful tool for understanding the brain and the central nervous system in humans and across many animal species. Diversity, equity, and inclusion each have their own definitions and contexts in which they're used. Diversity is any dimension that can be used to differentiate groups and people from one another. And we often think about how to construct diverse groups and the power that these groups bring in the context of education. Inclusion engages each individual and makes people feel valued as being essential to the success of whatever organization we are a part of. And equity in education means making sure every student has the support they need to be successful. And that requires understanding the unique challenges and barriers faced by individual students or populations of students and removing those barriers. And oftentimes diversity, equity, and inclusion requires challenging the system itself in which education is embedded. So how does this all come together, and how does this connect to the speakers we have with us today? Well, first, when we break down diversity, equity, and inclusion into their core components, it requires deep thought about questions that many neuroscientists have been studying for a long time. Questions such as, how does stress affect learning and memory? How do we decide who to trust under conditions of uncertainty or when we don't understand what someone is about? Does social threat inhibit creativity, the kind of creativity that we need to learn and explore about others? What do we know about biases and decision-making and reasoning? And can that help us create a more inclusive and equitable educational context? And many neuroscientists learn a lot about the brain by understanding disease states and what happens when parts of our brain and nervous system fail us. So, what is the experience of social relationships when we lose the capacity of empathy or other aspects of emotion? And so part of the conversation today is to consider, what do neuroscientists need to do to link the brain and the nervous system related mechanisms to complex social interactions, particularly regarding social groups. And so we have two renowned neuroscientists, Elizabeth Phelps, the Pershing Square Professor of Human Neuroscience in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University. And broadly speaking, she explores the impact of emotion and affect on cognition. But this is really just a small part of her work. She studies emotion and decision-making, mechanisms of threat control, stress, memory, just an amazing and remarkable scholar using multiple tools. And we also have Professor Michael Shadlen, a professor of neuroscience here at Columbia University's Mortimer B. Zuckerman Brain and Behavior Institute. Broadly speaking, he explores the brain's neural mechanisms responsible for reasoning and decision making. He's also a neurologist. He's also a person who thinks quite deeply about ethics. And at the moment, there isn't really an area that can link these broad concepts related to DEI to these neural substrates. So we want to bring them into the conversation. But second, part of this conversation today is to consider the idea that science doesn't happen in a vacuum. The identity of the scientists matter, the assumptions we make about knowing what constitutes knowledge, what studies are privileged and what studies are shelved, what is the ecosystem in which neuroscience happens. And to join us for that part of the conversation, we're bringing in Dr. Dana Crawford. She's a new member of our Columbia community, and she's a scholar in residence at ZMBBI. And part of what she is helping us to do is to understand, expose, and transform the underbelly of neuroscience, really by trying to understand what are the assumptions that are made around the ecosystem related to neuroscience. And she's linking that to what she's calling the Crawford bias reduction theory and training. I've already read quite a bit about it, and it's quite remarkable. And it provides a systemic approach to increasing awareness, understanding the manifestations, and reducing bias, prejudice, and racism. But third, and perhaps not most importantly, but to tie this all together, we have to ask the big questions. How far have we come in addressing big and important questions related to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion? When I personally think about the history of DEI, particularly as programs of research in the social sciences and in psychology, which is my home, I naturally think about Grutter and Gratz. President Bollinger, our university president, was an integral part of two monumental Supreme Court cases that have affected and will continue to affect society and education for decades, and that's Grutter and Gratz. And at least in psychology, my own home discipline, much of the research on diversity was inspired by these Supreme Court cases and the social scientific evidence that was used. Moreover, with all of the many challenges facing society today, with the continuing pandemic, the new civil rights era that is upon us, we need to revisit these questions and figure out what new questions need to be asked. And so he is joining us to help us think through those big questions and what does neuroscience in the context of higher education have to offer. And finally, the critical voice here is the voice of leaders, policymakers, and educators who work directly with students on a day-to-day basis. And this is why I can think of no better person to directly be part of this conversation than Wanda Holland Greene. Wanda is head of the school at the Hamlin School in San Francisco, a mission-driven institution dedicated to best practices and innovation in the education of girls and young women. She's also an alumna of Columbia College, like myself, and is a current member of the board of trustees for Columbia University. And given what I know about Wanda, she probably does some neuroscience studies in her spare time as well. So I want to welcome all of you to this conversation. I do have an opening sort of question, and then we can sort of start at the micro level, move to the macro level, and we will go back and forth for about 40 minutes before we open the panel for discussion. So I'd like to start off with you, Lee, and if you could just tell us a little bit about your entry into this topic of neuroscience and diversity, equity, and inclusion in education, and what are you thinking about in terms of some of the big questions?
First of all, thank you, Valerie, very, very much. And I want to thank Pamela, especially for all of the work in setting up the Scholars Program. I mean, this is an enormous and heroic effort to try to, you can hear me, right? Well, yeah. To try to link the work in neuroscience to the humanities, to the social sciences, to law, and so on. So it's a really, really important effort, and Pamela has led this, been behind it, and many faculty, as she indicated, have been a part of this. So I'm just thrilled by it. So for me, the questions of neuroscience, of social sciences, and diversity, and civil rights, and so on, because I think one has to be very broad in understanding what it is we're talking about. That is, when we use the word diversity, it can seem like a sort of small thing, but this is really important to American society, that we understand this. So my entry point, I guess I would say, is affirmative action and civil rights connected to it. So the basic overview of this is universities started taking race and ethnicity into account in the late 60s and 70s as Brown versus Board of Education in the country set us on a more just course. And colleges and universities felt that they had to do more to try to advance integration and fairness and justice in their institutions, and so started considering race and ethnicity. In the late 70s, early 80s, the Supreme Court had a case involving the constitutionality of taking race into account. And that case is very well known. It's called Bakke, and there was not a clear majority, but there was one opinion that everybody paid attention to until the case that I was involved with, and that was Justice Powell's opinion. And Powell said that from his point of view, and again, it became the guiding principle that everybody followed, was that under the Constitution, you could take race and ethnicity into account if you were doing it for the benefits of the educational benefits of diversity. Never defined what that meant, never said how it was different from the other rationale, which I'm about to say, but that's just the way it was put. You could do it for diversity. The other possible rationale for affirmative action was that there had been several centuries of terrible injustices and discrimination that continued on into the present. And it was critically important that our institutions act to rectify that. And Powell said, if you do this for that reason, it is unconstitutional. Now, that was a defining moment in the history of higher education and the history of civil rights in America. My case, the one that I was involved in, was sued shortly after I became president of Columbia and Michigan, decided that I would really fight this, lead it, and so on. And we won in the Supreme Court a majority. It was the first time a majority of the Supreme Court upheld affirmative action as practiced at the law school at the University of Michigan. Again, repeating Powell's rationale that the benefits, educational benefits of diversity outweighed the problems of treating people differently according to race. I mean, that was the argument that was made. So there was a firm majority. We had another case involving Texas, University of Texas, called Fisher. That reaffirmed the Grutter, and now we have the Harvard case, and here we are. And so whatever can be said by neuroscience and social science about this is critically important. And I can come back, Valerie, to the question, how does science, social science, play into the decision-making of the Supreme Court under the Constitution? But that's the basic framework for me.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. And we will circle back to that question about the social scientific evidence. Wanda, what is your entry point?
Thank you, Valerie. You know, I wear multiple hats this afternoon, and the first, of course, is my deep love for Columbia and my loyalty as a trustee. With that hat on, an entry point, I think about how our university as a whole supports just societies, and Lee just talked so beautifully about that our university has to be about creating a more equitable world, and I enter the conversation through that lens, as well as through what Lee has also talked about as the fourth purpose. So I love seeing all of these juicy, wonderful scholars here whose scholarly knowledge can be applied to solving our world's most pressing problems right here and right now. That gets me fired up for the world. So that's my trustee hat. My practitioner hat, my day job. I'm in my office here at the Hamlin School in San Francisco. I feel that I am in the business of human thriving, in building capacity. That is what teachers do. Teachers are the ultimate brain trainers. So our work is deeply rooted in neuroscience and cognitive psychology. If you point to a teacher that hasn't studied Piaget and Bruner, I'm going to tell you they weren't trained well. So our work is rooted in the work that these wonderful professors and researchers do every day. And I also come to this space as a Black woman in America who's married to a Black man who's raising Black children, boys, and it comes from a very personal place as well. So I've got trustee, practitioner, and mom and spouse, and together, my interest in this conversation today is deep and enduring. I'm so glad to be here.
Thank you. So let's turn to Mike. We'll have Mike, and then Liz, and then Dana. What is your entry point into this topic? And you and I have had some great conversations, and maybe a collaboration will come out. You never know.
I hope 5 collaborations come out of this. Thanks for the invitation. I'm really excited to be a part of this. I'm going to do a Dana Crawford style disclosure, having attended her workshops, which are terrific if anyone ever gets a chance. So I'm a neuroscientist, a neurologist, and a musician. I'm a white man, and therefore, despite my views, the beneficiary of white privilege and systemic racism. I'm the father of 2 biracial daughters, 1 transgender, 1 cis. I hold progressive political views, I try to maintain a level of activism, and I study how the brain makes decisions. And that's my entry point here is that last point. Now, I want to disclose also that I don't believe that neuroscience study of the brain at the level of how it works necessarily, or in any way displaces other levels of understanding, the psychological level, the education level, social level, ethics, policy, and so forth, just as explaining how a dancer moves doesn't make the move any less beautiful, right? I study how the brain actually incorporates bias into decision-making, and not right now, but I hope during the course of this discussion, I'll try to convince you that it's a good thing, actually. But it has to be tamed, and it goes awry in all kinds of ways. And if we understand it, then we can tame it. And then I think I'm a little bit beyond my research into what we learned from the study of decision-making, which is ultimately basically the study of thought. We learn some topics that I think might guide us towards looking past the sunset provision to the following sunrises, and how we're going to actually really push with firm scientific and also philosophical basis the need for DEIB, the B for belonging.
Thank you so much. And for those of you who are wondering, the sunset provision, Lee can say it better than I can, but Justice O'Connor said in her opinion that in 25 years, we should revisit affirmative action, with an eye that it will no longer be necessary. And that is, coming close. I believe it's like 2028, or it's very close, which makes these questions and what new evidence is around, I think it brings a level of urgency. So let's turn to you, Liz. Thank you so much for joining us. What is your entry point into this topic?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I feel honored, especially being the one non-person without a Columbia association.
That's what we forgive you, Liz. It's okay.
Thank you for having me. I think when we think about entry points, I can think about the professional one, meaning my scientific one, and then of course the personal one. Personally, as a woman in science, I'm a little bit of an underrepresented minority myself in neuroscience. Also, I am the mother of a biracial child. And so I think about these things quite a bit in terms of her future. In terms of the professional interest, I started studying memory. And really sort of in humans. So I'm interested in studying, humans primarily, but I pay a lot of attention to the neuroscience in non-human animals. And I became really convinced that you could understand psychology better by really looking at the neuroscience in depth. So I started collaborations with people who study rodents and looked at the influence of emotion on learning and memory, and more recently decision-making. And, really tried to link up the human brain with the beautiful detailed models they have in non-human animals. But I always was really interested in how is it we're using, the reason I got into emotion was how is it we use memory and learning outside the laboratory. And when we think about learning in the social context, we think about social learning and the lifetime history we have of learning about other individuals. And so, even though I started studying these kind of very artificial learning paradigms that I derived from rodents, I then started to look at things like how did that play into social learning about race, for instance, right? And so about 20 years ago, I did some of the very first social neuroscience studies looking at race bias. And since then, I've sort of tried to continue that approach, right? So let's both pay attention to the detailed neuroscience, the kind of things that are emerging from the non-human animal work, and also bring it all the way out to the social questions we care about. How is it now that we think about in a learning context, learning about other people, and how does that speak to the importance of diversity, especially given our cultural history and the cultural learning we're all exposed to. And so that's really been the kind of two hats I wear as a scientist, sort of going from the detailed neuroscience to the cultural learning and diversity and inclusion and how we bring them together.
So, well, thank you. And I think what people don't know is the two of you are quite extraordinary in that it's very hard to do that, to go from the molecular to the high level to back and forth. Not many people do it well. So I think people assume that because they see it, it can happen. But part of it is how do we build a community of scholars who can do that? Dana, what is your entry point? And welcome to Columbia. We're just so, we need you.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you for just inviting me into this space and just how lovely it is to have this conversation, to ask these questions, and also for everyone who's joined us that, in these times of pandemics, plural, it just becomes harder to show up. So thank you. I answer this conversation in a variety of ways. So first, as a Black woman who has experienced racism, sexism, bias, prejudice, also as a person who has likely been biased, prejudiced, perhaps even racist towards people, I think about this as I enter this as a human, recognizing the humanitarian crisis of racism and how much it can really be damaging to all of us. How I spend my days are typically helping people figure out how to have really uncomfortable conversations that can be very painful, but are also very anchored in their values. Many of us have values to be anti-racist, to be bias reductionist, but we betray ourselves often in those values and those moments when racism shows up in really scary ways and uninvited ways. We don't live our truths. So the work that I do in CBRT is really helping people be congruent with who they see themselves as, how they were trained, and also making a workforce that is about belonging, not just simply recognizing diversity. And so the ways that I do that is creating different workshops that we look at awareness, investigation, and reduction of our bias, prejudice, and racism on an individual, interpersonal, and institutional level. And how do we do that in a systematic way and not in a kumbaya way where everybody gets together and talks about like just feelings, but what does it mean to identify the ways that we're activated and then cope with those in ways that we can actually institute change. And so I come to this conversation having studied psychology first, but also African-American studies. I was a nurse before I was a psychologist. I was a poet, I was an MC, I was a Division I athlete at Howard. I've done a lot. And in all of those spaces, I have seen racism show up and show that face regardless of if it's on a stage, if it's on a track, if it's at the bedside, if it's the most lovely birthing experience and that maternal mortality rates that impact Black women. It's everywhere. And so I enter this conversation with a passion for us to really dismantle the racism that can destroy us all if we don't figure it out.
So thank you. And we're also we'll circle back to all of us, but you're doing some incredible work with this that Mike acknowledged through ZMBBI, which is really quite groundbreaking to think about the scientists, the ecosystem. And so we want to share. I'm sure you're busy these days. So I want to go back to both Mike and Liz, and maybe we can start. And I want to sort of focus on the molecular level. That doesn't mean that the rest of us can't hop in. But if you could just share with us, maybe we'll start with Mike, and then turn to Liz. If you could share a little bit about some of the work that you do, Mike, related to decision making, related to probabilistic reasoning, also related to understanding disease states. Can you share with us just a few of your programs of research, and how do you think we can use what you know and what others in your area know to think more deeply about these broader level questions, whether it's specifically about race in the context of affirmative action, or more broadly around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? So take us a little bit from the micro and the molecular to the macro, if you can. And also, I know you could do this, but I know you could throw some jazz and improvisation in there. You're also a professional guitarist, not just like a, round the way. You're like really in it and perform. So throw some jazz and creativity in there too. And do it in 30 seconds. Okay, go.
Okay. On your mark, it's set. Okay. All right. Look, under the hood, the brain is a pretty rational agent. Okay. I mean, well, that's a mixture of levels, but the brain makes decisions according to the laws of probability. I mean, in very simple decisions. And what I mean by that is that it gives more weight to more reliable evidence and less weight to less reliable evidence as we reach decisions. It trades off speed and accuracy in a way that's appropriate to the condition. Sometimes you need to make a fast decision and don't mind being a little bit less accurate. The connection to medicine, I'm going to skip. I'll just say that by understanding the basic mechanisms of decision making, I think we do it. Plato used this term carving nature at its joints. I think we carve higher brain function at its joints when we study the building blocks of decision making. But let me speak more directly to your question, because if I just talk a little bit about bias, okay? So when you make a decision, you don't make it in a vacuum. You make a decision based on evidence. And as I said, you want to weigh that evidence in accordance with its reliability. But it would also be a mistake to ignore biases. So for example, I mean, have you heard of this virus, COVID? You probably have. If you're working in New York at a certain period of time and you see someone with a cough, you might be a little bit quicker to diagnose COVID than you were, well, years ago, we didn't know what it was, but than you were, when it first broke out in February and so forth. So it's very important to do that. And of course, when you weigh that, your prior knowledge, in this case, the prevalence of a disease in the community, with the evidence, you should do that in accordance with the degree that the evidence is reliable. So less reliable evidence, if you think that COVID is prevalent, you ought to have a quick trigger finger to diagnosing COVID. Okay, so that's the right way to do medicine. It's the right way to make decisions. Okay, now, of course, one reason you might not have reliable evidence is you listen to Fox News, or you just have lousy information, or you don't read your history, or you don't know about Wilmington, and on and on. There's a bunch of reasons why we can allow biases which kind of enter in all kinds of ways to take hold of us, and it might be simply because we lack the knowledge to overcome them. Okay, so that's one thing we've shown, that the brain really does do that. It takes an account, it incorporates bias in the decision process in accordance with its unreliability. The less reliable the evidence, the more the bias matters. That's a good thing. Another thing we've learned, though, is that bias can be discounted. So, for example, go back to this diagnosing COVID. We published a paper a few years ago where we showed that if you now ask people, like, how do they come up with the idea that COVID is so prevalent in my own practice? I don't practice anymore, but whatever. So if I went home and I said, I diagnosed 9 out of 10 people with COVID today, do I think that the prevalence is 90%? No, I discount the fact because I know that there's another kind of alternative world. We call it counterfactual confidence, in which I would just be acting on the evidence alone and not with my bias. Okay, and I would use that to make a better judgment of what I thought the reality was, despite the fact that it's affecting my practice moment by moment. And the brain is able to do that, but the brain's only able to do that, we think, when it has more expertise. So again, training, best practices, knowing one's history, having access to good information. These are all things that counteract bias. And I'll say one more thing, is that under the hood, I just said, meaning under your skull, there is this very rational organ, the brain. But the thing is, we can't really be rational when it comes to complex situations, where you're combining information from many, many sources. Even a computer can't quite work out the probabilities without taking shortcuts, okay? So what we do is we take little shortcuts. And one of the things we do to take shortcuts is we create narrative. And that's how we get our way. I call it navigating through high dimensions of information, okay? And to do that well, you can't really do it with calculating probabilities in our brains. What we do is we tell stories to each other, and the stories themselves invite all kinds of danger. So one of the dangers is that we mistake conditional probabilities for joint probabilities. And so we think when someone's asking us whether someone is a bank teller and a feminist. This is a famous problem by Kahneman and Tversky. We think that they're asking us, if you already knew that this person was a feminist, could they be a bank teller, or vice versa? That's a conditional probability. And those kinds of mistakes happen when we tell stories, because if we tell stories, we go into from A to B, and then to place C, and we ask, what's the probability you're going to go to place D? Well, we think of that as, well, I was already in place C, it's just that probability, but not like the joint probability of going to A to B to C and so forth. And so we make those mistakes all the time. And because we depend on narrative, both to navigate through the complex ecosystem of the lives that we lead, the kinds of problems we actually have to face, that means that that the narrative, that is the writers of history, the people who tell the stories, have an undue, perhaps, influence on the decisions we make. Okay, so now I'm a little bit past the neuroscience, but I'm saying to get past our animal type brains, we do it with narrative, and then who wrote the narrative and our exposure to the more proper narratives. I'll come back to stories like Wilmington that most people do not even know about in the United States, not Delaware, but North Carolina, is something we need to be doing.
Yeah. So that, I mean, and then when I think about what you're saying, I mean, you're helping us to understand not just that knowledge about the brain mechanisms work, but what it's leading us to in terms of expertise and narrative and so on. Let me turn to Liz. I mean, you have done some of the really early groundbreaking work in the context of race and neuroscience. You've also gone on to do just, a million other things related to threat detection, anxiety prediction. Tell us a little bit about one of your programs of research and help us think about it through the lens of these topics of diversity and equity and inclusion. You have so many of them, but just share one of them with us.
Oh, I will make the point, Valerie, that, I came at this from learning and memory, right? And from the role of emotion, right? And obviously, when you think about emotion, the things that make us most emotional are other people. And so you cannot ignore the social psychology if you really want to understand the influence of emotion on learning and memory and decisions. But my research has primarily been on sort of cognitive mechanisms of learning, memory, and decisions. I got into the social neuroscience and to studying race bias because it seemed, something that you just can't ignore if you want to understand this. And the reason, and it's been a sideline of my research for a long time, but since my first studies about 20 years ago, in part because this research is very hard to fund in neuroscience. There isn't really a good funding mechanism for funding research on race bias in the brain. The National Institute of Health doesn't do it. And so it's always been something on the side that I do. So I have a long line of research unrolling slowly over the years that have tied in the rest of my work on learning and decision making and the influence of stress with race and race bias. And so, I could give you, a very little short history of some of that work. And so I really got interested in studying this because I was looking at different memory systems in the brain. And there are some that are expressed sort of by you telling me what you know. And there are others that are expressed by you sort of showing me what you know. Showing me what you know sort of for your physiology. And this really tied in well with research that my colleague at the time, Masrin Banaji, and currently I was at Yale and Harvard with her. I spent 20 years at NYU in the interim. And was doing on implicit and explicit race bias, right? So that really, we started to say, well, can the same brain systems that are involved in this sort of implicit expression of our emotional memories be involved in the implicit expression of race bias? And, we did the first brain imaging study of this and found that they could. And so, that we saw the same brain regions involved, right? And so, and again, we know already that you can express memories in many different ways. And then, now we're trying to get it. So once we have those memories, once we learn them, like once we learn that, say, something to us, we see something as a threat to us, let's say. And this, when we think about social others and we think about our in-groups and our out-groups are often threats to us. So once we have that learning, and I would argue here is where we have the cultural learning. And cultural learning is, to me, somewhat like perceptual learning. I mean, the reasons why we see illusions is because we get these patterns in our visual system that bias how we see things. And they're so ingrained that we can't unsee things even when we know they're illusions, right? I think the same thing happens with cultural learning. We grew up with these stereotypes. We know them whether or not we believe them. We can all tell you what the classic stereotypes are, whether or not you believe them to be true. It's part of our cultural learning. And I think it can influence us in the same subtle way that perceptual learning does. But then the question becomes, how is it, how do those biases change your future learning? So now when you're interacting with somebody of your group or a different group, how do you respond differently? So one thing, for instance, we found is now, let's say, somebody did something bad to you. Now you have new information that this was, that this person is actually a good person. You're much slower to update your learning if it's somebody that's not of your race, right? It takes you longer, it takes you more information that this person is now, not the bad person you initially thought they were, to now learn to trust that person again, right? That's just one example. And this was based on some neurobiological work, just the ideas of it. Other things we've looked at since that is, how is it when you have to decide if somebody were sort of at personal fault for something, or the situation caused them to do it. So this is called an attribution decision. You're more likely to make a personal attribution when somebody acts in a bad way if somebody's of another race, meaning that they did it, not the situation caused them to do it. And if you're stressed, you're also more likely to do it. So it takes a little bit of cognitive effort to not make that personal attribution decision. And this obviously plays into legal decisions of, of responsibility.
Yep.
And so, my work has has looked at all of these regularities we get from learning, and then how do we overcome them? So I think the work now that we're really in the line of race bias research is saying, okay, so we're doing a lot of work on how we learn that things we thought were threats are not. And this is very relevant to anxiety disorders, let's say, how is it we learn things are safe? But it's also, once we've had this strong cultural learning that we've broken people up into groups and other groups are a threat to us, how do we change that learning? It's a sticky learning, so it's not so easy. Yep. And diversity, I mean, any social psychologist would tell you that contact matters, not just contact and interaction, right? Contact and learning about the other people matters, and that's one of the best ways, but it's very difficult learning to do, to sort of do this unlearning of the cultural learning we all grew up with. But, for all of those topics, we get into the neuroscience, and what I think, we all really care about the psychology here, right? But the neuroscience feeds into the psychology and vice versa. We need to understand psychology really well to understand what the brain is doing. And then once we understand the mechanisms of the brain, we actually get some more insight into the psychology. And so it's really that interplay that I try to bring into my work on this topic.
So, I mean, that is excellent. I have other questions, but I want to just take a moment to see what, Wanda, Dana, Lee, what are your thoughts about what you're hearing? Is there something here? Are we crazy to sort of level this up to think about the implications for diversity, equity, inclusion? Any of you can just reflect on what they're sharing.
I'll say that, every adult who needs to unlearn something started out as a 5-year-old in kindergarten. And I know Dana has her pediatric hat on, and they, we start out with a distilled set of experiences by the time you arrive in kindergarten. And part of what I think excellent teachers do, right, and excellent leaders of schools do is you compose your community. So, and I actually believe we're more segregated in schools in 2021 than we were in the 60s, 50s, et cetera. But as we compose communities and bring people together so that they have that cognitive jolt to look at someone else that says, oh, I better work harder because someone is going to have a different perspective in class, you actually get more creativity and more deliberate work when you have a diverse community. But I think we have to start at the beginning, because that's the anchoring experience. We talk about anchoring when we talk about negotiations. If you were, Lee went to law school, he knows, where you start, whether I'm negotiating the price of a car or negotiating my relationship with you, where you start influences where you end up, right? So if I give you a price here, we're always going to anchor around that space. So when we anchor experiences in K-12 education around talking about how the brain works, the brain is a muscle, pointing out stereotypes. I have third graders at my school who can point out a stereotype very quickly because they were actually taught about stereotype threat. They were taught about stereotypes generally. And so when I hear Liz talk, I think about, back it up. Bring this learning to the K-12 space in very deliberate, explicit ways, so that there's frankly less to do in adulthood. Because it's the adults who are, making taking the shortcuts that Michael talked about, unnecessarily and to people's peril.
Yeah.
As you probably know, Wanda, the evidence suggests that these biases are usually there even before kindergarten.
Exactly right.
Yeah. Lee or Dana, what I want to get your thoughts, and then I want to get back to this question of Lee and social scientific evidence. But what are your reflections?
Yeah, I think there's so many important points that both Liz and Michael and Wanda raised. I think about it as a pediatric psychologist. I recognize a newborn, a 3-month-old baby recognizes race and has preference, right, at 3 months old. But I also recognize that little sweet baby or that 5-year-old is going to school that has adults that are in charge of their lives. And so in the same way that we can raise the next generation and attempt to teach them new things, when they see racism, when they see bias and they point it out and the teacher feels so uncomfortable because of the emotions that get activated, then how are we really going to train that next generation? How are they really going to be empowered? And so because of that relationship between the child and the adult, it becomes critical that we explore our emotional experiences when we talk about these issues. And so we can do all the diversity, we can bring everyone in, and what will end up happening is that some groups will be more exposed and they'll undo and learn some new things, and then another group is going to be really traumatized and really injured. And until we figure out how do we have these conversations in ways that people can be safe, in ways that people who do not have as much power can have access, can have space of repair, of healing, then we're going to run into the same cycles over and over again. How many times have we seen cultural consciousness waves? You know, we saw it last year with Breonna Taylor. Before that, it was, you know, Eric Gardner. Before that, it was Emmett Till. And so we have to really start to think about not just the psychology that happens in the sense of what our thoughts are, but our affective, our behavioral, our physiological reactions when these things play out in the brain. And so I think Liz's point about thinking about memory, the stories we tell, narrative psychology, these are really crucial elements. And as Mike points out, the repeated training. The issue with that in most academic spaces, in most, I would even say K through 12 and medical spaces, is we are often time impoverished. And so it is a privilege to even have the space within an organization to say, we are going to dedicate, which I am so impressed with Zuckerman for, we are going to dedicate hours of our resources to figuring out how do we have diversity, equity, and inclusion with belonging. And that's not going to just happen with funding our pipeline program. That's not going to just happen with having a great new diversity, quote unquote, hire. It's not going to happen in those ways. It's going to happen when we move our jaw and we start to have different stories and we have spaces of safety.
Yes, yes. Lee, I'll let you reflect, and then I want to ask a bigger question about evidence.
No, go ahead, Valerie, because I know you're looking for time. So
well, you know, I don't know why I was selected to be the moderator, because I go over and everything. I don't even know what time zone we're in. You know, so at least, you know, for me as well, you know, one of the things that as I'm just looking at all of us on the screen, you know, I have been in spaces where I'm part of, you know, selection committees looking at the future of the next generation of neuroscientists, as well as other spaces and thinking about how do you build an equitable workplace, an equitable school. And the thing that was sort of striking me is that I've never had this conversation before. And I was sort of thinking about, you know, one, building the next generation of neuroscientists, and how do we sort of, you know, create this kind of space? How do we build the funding mechanisms? How do we build them? Am I?
You did not consistently. No.
we're all doing this.
Okay, we'll just blame Lee. But also, so I think that having the kind of training, I think, is going to be important. The funding is going to be important, as well as sort of, you know, the levels of analysis, which we don't want to see. But my question to you, Lee, is: do these levels of analysis actually matter when we think about evidence? So you know, there's some sort of classic research on, you know, what's called the allure of neuroscience. Some of that work is replicated, others of it I'm still trying to sort out, but the general idea is that neuroscientific evidence is sort of seen as more compelling oftentimes when it's sort of added along with other kinds of evidence. And so can you help us sort of think about this sunset clause, 2028? What kind of questions do we think about?
Yeah, I mean, so there's so many things that have been said that, to me, you know, could spark a really very long discussion. I mean, when I hear Elizabeth say there really isn't funding for trying to understand the basis of racial bias in neuroscience, I mean, that's shocking. When I I mean, that really goes to the question, one of the questions you raised, Valerie, which is, how do we construct a research program, an educational program for a university that tries to answer questions that really matter? So, this is, Wanda raises the fourth purpose. That's the essence of the fourth purpose, trying to bring academic work to bear on real problems. When I hear Michael talk about the need for narratives as a way of dealing with these issues, I mean, I want to know a lot more. So one of the roles I can play in this discussion, but I certainly want to qualify it as not the only way in which I think about these, but it is sort of the way in which this program has been framed. In the United States Supreme Court, we are dealing interpreting the Constitution. We are asking ourselves, what do we value in our society, and how do we understand what we claim are our values? So when in Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, there were social science data that were presented to the court, made their way into the decisions about the harmfulness of discrimination. When we had the case at the University of Michigan, we made a real effort. Nancy Cantor, who was the provost at the time, and of course a colleague of yours, I mean, in the sense of a psychologist, and then Pat Gurin, who did this work on, do people learn better in diverse environments? And we put that, the answer was yes, and we put that into our briefs. Well, the question now, I think, is 18 years later, what greater scientific understanding is there that supports or rejects the premise, the value that we are discussing here, which is, if people are working, living, being educated, doing research in a diverse environment, racial, ethnic, what other kinds of diversity, does that improve the thinking on average or over time or in certain contexts? What do we know about that fundamental question in a scientific? That's when we go to the Supreme Court next, and it's going to happen in the next, I mean, it may be the Harvard case, it may be the University of North Carolina case. After that, it will be a case before the United States Supreme Court. And the questions will be, are we still committed to interpreting the Constitution as recognizing the constitutional legitimacy of taking race and ethnicity into account to build a diverse student body, because that is a rational, good educational judgment? What do we know scientifically to support that? I would add, because it's also my view, that Powell made a mistake in excluding as a justification the continuation of racial discrimination and ethnic discrimination. I think he made a grave mistake in that judgment. And the court has continued to make a grave misjudgment in excluding that rationale, if they could see that, in fact, the continuing legacy of discrimination has these impacts on, what can we present to the courts is scientifically, in neuroscience and social science, that will play that, in a deeper level than we could 20, 40 years ago.
Yep. Liz, Mike, help us think about that.
So, I mean, I will. No, everyone's having this problem. It's horrible. There really isn't, in terms of bringing the neuroscience into the conversation, there really is a funding problem, right? It really is the case. Like I said, I've been doing, my primary area is learning, memory, and decision making, and the influence of emotion. But I've certainly had students who would have pursued a career looking at neuroscience and race bias had it been a viable career path, meaning they could fund their research. So I think to get the neuroscience integrated, you really need two things. One is you need to have a space to enable the conversations that we're the kind of conversation we're having today. Having people like Wanda and Dana talking to people like Mike and me, right? To sort of integrate our perspectives. And, when you do this sort of cross-disciplinary work, I've done, kind of when I work with clinical psychologists thinking about anxiety, there's often not, sort of just a way to fund ideas that you're sort of coming up with by having conversations, by sharing your perspectives. If you get a standard grant, you're going to be writing a grant that's got like your 3 aims, and you got to check them off. And neuroscience, as you know, is expensive research, I'm sure, as you know. And so, so I think that's been a real impediment in bringing neuroscience into the conversation. One is just both funding the neuroscience consistently enough that people could pursue this as not like me, like a little sideline that I have that kind of takes my insights and applies them to this question every once in a while when I can kind of, work it out. But it's somebody who actually has this as their research agenda. And there is really nobody, I think, that this is their primary research agenda, because there's no real career path for that at this point in time. But also the second one, to sort of be able to have the longer conversations where you're going back and forth and talking to individuals with different perspectives and learning from each other, because, collaboration across areas takes a lot of learning about, what's expected and what are the issues, and, how do you merge those things together. So I think, I think those things there's a lot of enthusiasm for those things. It's been difficult to make them happen.
Yeah.
For really practical reasons.
Yeah.
And, maybe things will change. There seems to be, a sort of more enthusiasm for trying to address these questions today than there was 20 years ago when I started this. But we'll see.
Yeah. Mike, what do you think?
I'm very excited about the idea that we end up collaborating across the domains. Like, I could imagine working with you, Wanda, and I mean, I'm going to supply a very theoretical perspective that's an extrapolation even of the neural mechanisms that I study. But I think that that's about the level that neuroscience, I mean, obviously neuroscience of stress, and, there are some very immediately applicable neuroscience topics to the harm of racism at all levels of all ages. But let me take you a little bit to the kind of a very high level kind of idea. I mean, and meaning completely impractical, although I would like to see it turn practical. So one of the things that we've learned through the lens of decision making is that the way knowledge is structured in our minds is as interrogation. Okay, the parts of the brain that know, when you lose them, you have what's called agnosias. When the parts of the brain that know don't know because they process information, but because they were trying to answer questions about what it was going to do with that information. Okay, it's an activist kind of perspective on knowledge. Now, the thing is that that sort of says that when we educate, we're really educating people not to learn the facts, but to know how to ask the questions to find the facts. Okay, that's the essence of the curriculum, to create thinkers as opposed to people who answer by rote. Now the thing is that the questions that we ask are going to be determined by who else is in the room, and our backgrounds that bring us to a point to ask questions. And so once again, we could argue, I think, and probably study even the benefits of bringing people together with different perspectives at various ages in order to achieve the goal of asking better questions. I mean, one of the reasons we don't have funding for Liz's research is because we haven't been asking that question. We haven't had colleagues that have been pushing to answer that question. Now, I want to address the reparations kind of idea, or really the thing that is related to reparations, in my view, which is that I think that in some ways I'm an optimist, and that I believe that there was a time where I shouldn't say no one, but the liberal white people were not interested in reparations for the same reason that Powell penned that opinion, which is the belief in kind of equality and meritocracy and things like that, with an ignorance for the history, okay, for the racism as a historical phenomenon and putting us in a certain place. And I think maybe the country, although maybe not the current Supreme Court, but the country is ready for reparations. I mean, I think intellectually, emotionally, I think it's, you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates, it's not a radical anymore. It's sort of like, just baseball. Okay, so, so that's one thing I want to say. The other thing is that in terms of the institution, I think a case could be easily made in the professional schools, that it's essential that we have a diverse faculty, to make other members of the faculty join that faculty, to make students at the age group that you teach, Wanda, look forward to the possibility of being on that faculty or serving as doctors and nurses and so forth, and on and on. So there's all kinds of different reasons for us to take positions that are activist positions, affirmative activist positions, that I think go beyond where we were mentally back in the day of Bakke.
Interesting. Okay, so I want to build on that and take it in a slightly different direction, and this is going to implicate you, Dana. And so, as a scientist, one of the things that I've learned, the hard way is that there are certain people that are considered smart. There are certain people that are considered not smart. There are these implicit rules about what is publishable and what is not publishable. And that sort of seeps into the science in very reliable ways. And I'd love for you to share with us what you are learning as part of your projects. Can you share with us a little bit about what you're doing at Zuckerman? How does it connect to your Crawford, anti-bias training? And I believe what Mike is saying. I believe what Liz is saying, and I certainly believe in the questions that Lee and Wanda are raising. I'm not entirely sure that the field of neuroscience, given, it's across multiple fields, can we really sustain it given the ecosystem that you're uncovering? So can you share with us a little bit about what you're doing, what you're hearing, and what do we need from your vantage point to build the kind of neuroscience, to ask the kind of questions that we're talking about today?
Yeah, no pressure, right, Valerie?
And 30 seconds again. 30 seconds.
It's such an interesting thing because the reality is science, as you started, does not exist in a vacuum. It would be wonderful that we would get great, solid data, and that would be enough to change hearts. Unfortunately, that is not. We could read all the studies that we want, and then when people get in a lab together, there are certain assumptions or stories that we say about those folks. There are certain ways that we interact that make it very clear that you do not belong here. I do not believe you belong here, and I'm not sure if you're worthy of this space. Now, when we start to really look in the mirror at ourselves as individuals and ask the question, what are the stories that I'm saying? Where did I learn these stories? Who taught me these stories? What continues to perpetuate these stories? And you start to understand the origin of how you became infected with racism, prejudice, and bias. Then you start to understand, how are you playing out these stories? What does it look like? How does it manifest? How do I interact when that story, that narrative that I'm telling myself is occurring in my lab, in my work? And then the next piece is, with the power that I have from an individual level to an interpersonal level, that now we've gathered some resources through networking, through scholarships, through funding, through grants, then we establish institutional guidelines and policies. And so the work that I'm doing at Zuckerman is just a part of the amazing interventions and innovations that Zuckerman was already doing. Really asking the question of, what does it look like for us as individuals to look in the mirror, and also to look out the window at what others need, to feel and understand that their voice is valued, that they belong, and not in the sense of I'm inviting you over to a dinner party, but in the sense of you belong here, as in you live here now, you're my roommate, you're my spouse, you have a place here. We all have a place in this science. And so what we're doing is every month for about 90 minutes, we as faculty, as administrative, as postdocs, as trainees get together and move our jaw and ask really uncomfortable questions about the ways that racism, prejudice, and bias is showing up in the science for everyone, how it's showing up in administration, how it's showing up in the research questions that doctoral students are even asking. How does that get perpetuated and how do we undo it? We also are engaging in really clear ways that we're asking, what are the outcomes? What are the measurable goals that we have? How do we check in about those goals? How are we hitting our targets? To really be systematic. You know, often when we have a cultural consciousness wave hit and people in the whole world decide, oh my God, racism is terrible, everyone comes together, shares their grievances, shares that, I would dare say, trauma porn of these horrific things. And then what? What does it mean to decide we actually want some measurable changes? We want to change ourselves as individuals. We want to get better interpersonally, and we're going to make some new rules and some new guidelines as an institution. And so Zuckerman has committed to that, but I will also say many other organizations that I'm working with around the country are also making those same commitments of using time, which is one of the greatest commodities that all of us have, to actually use our time to dedicate to this work. And so when we talk about funding, yes, it's funding the research, but it's also funding the time to apply, to dissect, to think about that same research.
Yeah, that is absolutely fascinating because, you know, part of this story of building something that combines neuroscientific evidence, maybe even sort of legal jurisprudence, thinking about neural mechanisms, you know, it cannot happen in an ecosystem where inequality at the level of the actual science and knowing exists. It just can't happen. Wanda, you are sort of front and center in my screen, and I'm curious, you know, A, what are you thinking at this moment, and B, you are an incredible educator. What are you hearing? Do you see something here in terms of linking these neural mechanisms, thinking about issues of representation, thinking about the neuroscience of the ecosystem, also top down, thinking about we're not just doing science for science sake. We have something at stake legally coming in several years. Do you see something here that is sustainable, maybe as both as a future discipline or even something that could start earlier in school? Tell us what your reflections are.
There's so much I want to, sit in I am in my office. I'm gonna just sit here and write when this is over. And yes, Michael, let's just do some work together. A couple things, and then I would, I know we need to look at our audience questions.
Yes.
One thing is I think we need to think about the pipeline of who's becoming a teacher, who's becoming a neuroscientist. I hope there are lots of people listening who are in that career contemplation crossroads space, because my contention is that we need to ensure that people who are asking questions and seeking to change narratives go into the profession. And I remember being at Columbia in the 80s when I said I wanted to be an educator, people kind of looked at me like, are you really going to waste all this time and money into education? And I thought, there is no better form of activism than to be an educator. So I want to see more people who want to be activists. I suspect this generation of 20-something-year-olds and teens who are voting and who are, shaking up the world in profound ways, that if they enter professions where they are generally underrepresented or misrepresented, I'm hoping that we can not only increase the pipeline of who's walking into our professions, but then I'd love to see a wholesale reorganization of graduate schools in terms of education. And back to what Dana was saying about, well, if you put a teacher who has the unexamined life, if you will, in a classroom, who can't bear the emotional weight of talking about race, then that teacher is less inclined to interrupt the microaggression or the macro trauma that's happening right in front of their eyes. And I went to graduate school in the 80s and the early 90s. I stayed obviously very connected to how teachers are being trained, but I think we need to formalize the work and make neuroscience a part of teacher training in very explicit, powerful ways so we understand what is happening, and we equip teachers to move into spaces that allow them to truly be the activists and the change makers we need to see, and the narrative changers, right? Other thing I'm thinking about is something Michael said that just made me so grateful for the conversations that teachers are having, which is we're centering wellness and belonging in ways that we were not before. You know, when a child was not well, we sent them to Dana, we outsourced them, we exported them because teachers, that was beyond our scope of practice, and we didn't want to deal with harm because that was what other people did. And what I'm seeing now is a centering of this, what I think is a public health, mental health crisis that we're experiencing right now, largely the result of the harm of racism, the harm of this pandemic. Schools are kind of the lightning rod right now of what is happening in America. I think Nelson Mandela said there's no keener revelation of a society's soul than how you treat your children. And schools right now are screaming for support and advocacy. And we're seeing the neuroscience around mindfulness working really well. You know, some people think, you used to think it was like holding hands and, you know, a little bit of a kumbaya, but I'm telling you, mindfulness practices really work in helping children recast what they're seeing to calm themselves, to create self-soothing strategies for the real trauma that they're experiencing by being home. Not everyone who went home went to a haven over this last year, and they're coming back to school. And if adults who work with kids every day don't center wellness, belonging, and public health as a part of what we do as educators, we will not redeem schools from what has been truly traumatizing. So I'm thinking about both of those pieces, the adults coming into education, how we train them, and also how we center the conversation about the science of this brain and this heart, because, you know, you can forget about the math and the science and everything else you've decided to teach them if they fundamentally are not well as they're sitting in front of you.
Yes. Amen. This is such a fascinating conversation for me personally, and we're going to move to the Q&A. But I was a baby professor at Yale, and I think about what made me come to Columbia, and part of it is coming home because I was an undergrad. But intellectually, it was the promise of interdisciplinary thinking that was valued, and it was the promise of levels of analysis, and every person that I talked to could sort of move within their disciplines from the macro and the micro and back. And so I think that we are both demonstrating that kind of promise at a place like Columbia. I'm not sure if we answer the question, do we need like a DEI neuroscience? But I do think that we answer the question that we need to bring to bear multiple levels of analysis, multiple kinds of conversations to both think strategically about these big questions that Lee, you helped us to think about, as well as sort of advancing science. So I just just so much more to come. Pamela, I see that you have returned. You're going to help us to think through the many questions that I see the audience has. So maybe you can just field the questions and to who they would go to.
Yeah, thank you all so much. So many pieces have come together here. And, to Wanda's point, reorganize graduate schools. Why let's just reorganize the whole university, make it a place for the 21st century. And, that means interdisciplinarity. Okay, so the questions have really kind of clustered around a couple of different areas. The first, I think, is in the role of science and the role of neuroscience in society more generally, the kind of ecosystem of science and neuroscience that you all talked about. And, I love this. By the way, you're all getting lots of love in the questions here. People are tuning in from Greece, from Turkey. They are really excited about this panel. Something Wanda said, your brain is a muscle, we need neuroscience training, but it's not just your brain is a muscle, but, science is not just a method. Neuroscience is not just a set of a reasoning method or a set of theories, but a whole social and cultural ecosystem. And that's really where you need not just the neuroscience in the classroom, but really the kind of interdisciplinary exploration of mind, brain, and behavior. And, to that question, I just want to turn it over to Wanda, to that kind of cluster of issues. I want to turn the question over to Wanda to think about, how do we get this in? You began to actually answer this a little bit in your last comments. How do we actually translate this into curricula? How do we translate it really into the classroom on a daily basis?
It's a great question. And, the first, is I would say, and not because I'm a school leader, but it has to come from the leader of the school, the leader of the district, the leader of the, the superintendent. And I hate to say this, but so many people who are involved in decision-making in schools would cast themselves as politicians rather than educators or health experts. And sometimes, God bless them all, given everything we're going through, but the motivation is often not with students and their well-being in mind. So the first thing I think that has to happen is the right leaders need to be elected. Parents need to vote for the school board. Those elections that people just let go and don't pay attention to. But we need to give a careful eye who's in charge and what is that person's mindset, and how do we respectfully but vociferously push on the leaders to have a mindset that allows all children to thrive. And that sounds so basic, Pamela, that well, shouldn't every leader want everyone to thrive? I wish I could tell you that in education, that was the mindset, but it is not. So the first thing I think is get the right people in the seats to lead schools, lead districts, lead superintendent. Like the whole thing needs to be revisited in terms of leadership. I don't believe in waiting till that day happens. And in the meantime, I think each teacher in the classroom needs to take it upon themselves to ask themselves, am I actually causing learning? Grant Wiggins was this wonderful curriculum designer. He said, are you causing learning in the seats? A lot of teachers are standing in front of kids and designing experiences, and learning isn't actually happening. Part of what a great teacher does is says, how do I make the hard things easy and automatic? Because I don't want kids teaching themselves to read every day, right? At a certain point, that has to be automatic. And what are the things that I actually want to make effortful? Reading people, that needs to be effortful every day. And you need sophisticated teachers who are still committed to lifelong learning through professional development. I think professional development budgets are woefully under-resourced, whether it's credit hours or just doing something for learning's sake. I think we need to invest much more money in retraining. A lot of teachers have been in the classroom a long time, and they are teaching 21st century kids with 20th century pedagogy, and I think that needs to be revisited. So professional development and retraining for teachers, and I frankly think parents have a big role to play here. As parents continue to educate themselves, even if you don't have children, you have children at a public school, an independent school, a parochial school, charter school down the street, the citizenry, if you will, of our cities have a role to play in setting agendas for schools. And that sounds a little bit weird, but I think when the adults get outraged about education, these are the children who are going to be, paying into Social Security or, having jobs and moving into the economy. I think everyone who surrounds schools, they also have a role to play in supporting the school that is in your vicinity through whether it's fundraising, sending a kid to camp, lots of small things. But I think part of what will allow teachers to feel supported in doing the work is the collective support of the communities within which they reside. And that happens when a teacher has the courage to try something new and is supported by the principal, the parents. It just changes how effective they feel in the room. And so I see teachers as central to all of this in terms of their training, their support, and their feeling that they will not compromise their positions as professionals if they walk forward, because they're places where to have the conversation is dangerous.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to turn now to raising that question, almost the same question really, to Lee. How do you translate this into the institution of the university into higher education, and how do we get the kind of space and funding that is needed for this kind of work? I too was shocked by Liz's point that she simply couldn't get funding for this.
Right. So I think clearly working on diversity, and it's just such a weak word at this point. I mean, there's a powerful underlying set of motivations for this, but continuing to work on it every single day is critical. I mean, I could speak about this in lots and lots of dimensions. I mean, I have been struck, for example, how diversity, race, ethnicity, but particularly African Americans, just doesn't happen if you allow the institution to just function on its kind of own day in and day out basis. And I have to tell you, it's a mystery to me why that is so. And I mean, I have my own theories about it, but it remains still a mystery. In other words, the only way I have found over 25, 30 years of being a dean and university president that you get diversity within a university is by having a university-wide program and by having university efforts, especially at the search committee level and so on. I mean, just an insistence on it. So it's really quite interesting that people who are, I think, almost unanimously well-meaning and well-intended on this just does not translate into a diverse environment. So that's a big recognition for me. I have to say, I mean, I just have to repeat what I said earlier, this point that there is not sufficient funding and that the disciplines don't ask the questions naturally is, I think, I've always sort of, I don't want to say I'm completely surprised, but I am surprised. And so that seems to be something we should address, and we should address it now. I mean, not just we should, we have to. So I think, how research agendas are set, always a fascinating and important question. I think about this all the time, and not only with respect to issues of race, diversity, et cetera. I'll think I'm always curious. I mean, how do we figure out what are the questions we're going to be asking? And that's certainly true here. And it's very clear that refreshing that inquiry on a regular basis is the right way to go. I guess the last thing I would say is that, I'm always wary of, trying to ask what appear to be practical questions. We are in the business of pursuing knowledge, basic knowledge, without always having to be encumbered by, what have you done for me lately kinds of questions. But it is a really important issue. What have we learned in the space of a decade or 2 decades about critically important subjects, like how do people learn better in a diverse environment? I mean, it would be wonderful, and I'd be happy to fund this, a synopsis of what knowledge have we gained in these areas in the last decade, 2 decades. And is it right to ask the question in neuroscience, should we be exploring specifically the question of race in how the brain works? Now, I know that's a dangerous, I mean, what are the consequences of discrimination? What are the consequences of bias? What are the consequences? We study, I know, stress. How much do we study discrimination? How much, I mean, These are all the kinds of things that are raised in my mind by this panel, Pamela.
Yeah, and I just have to say that, I am a psychologist, and one of the things in preparing for this event, I have the stereotype that if you're doing neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, behavioral neuroscience, that's where the funding is. And I also was sort of surprised, I just assume if we have the questions, the funding is there, but then there is this underlying, how do intellectual agendas get set, and what is considered a good question? Yeah. And that also implicates, bias and so forth. So it's not to say that there's is no research, but it's
Right.
fascinating how why am I surprised that this panel is surprising, and that's worth inquiry. So I'll turn it back to you, Pamela. I just sort of jumped in there. Yeah, I'm sorry, Mike, did you wanted to say something? Sorry.
Just throw out something constructive, hopefully, which is that, we know from like brain plasticity, for example, that, English speakers, infants have the capacity, oh my God, have the capacity to understand Scandinavian vowels until such time as they don't need them to understand English, and then we lose it, okay? Now, in the brain, of course, we have plasticity going on through adolescence, and we're forming our in and out groups and our social constructs and our ability to rely on our neighbors for to help us group think or source our interrogations of the world, okay, which is what happens by the time we get to the university. I would think it'd be a fantastic area to study what happens at what level, at what age groups does mixing in various ways, enhance the ability for people to establish theory of mind. My sense that your mind works a bit like mine, and therefore trust it in certain ways. And that's a neuroscience inspired question that could make a difference through education, and that is eminently studyable, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think that's a good example of the kind of new research agenda that emerges from these kinds of conversations. This is a really common experience in our interdisciplinary panels, that we get people talking to each other, which are new, and come up with really new areas. I want to give Liz a quick chance to respond to that question about neuroscience and its agendas.
Yeah, well, one of the things I wanted to follow up on was a point you made, Lee. Even though it's been decades now where we've been aware of these things, yet you continually have to anew, lay out agendas for search committees and things like that. I mean, I think what you're speaking to is really the depth of cultural learning, particularly about race, but also, other race and ethnicities, and also gender. Is that, like I said earlier on, it's like perceptual learning. It's like learning how to see, right? When we have all this experience of these, biased ways the world work, and then we have such a hard time, even though we have good intentions, of sort of unlearning that. And so without those sort of top-down constraints, these things just seep back in over and over and over again. Yeah, I think that's that learning. That we're. And so that, and so I'm not surprised that that's the case, that we constantly have to be vigilant. And here's where I think neuroscience, learning, we know how we learn things, learn patterns. But how do we change our learning from patterns, right? That's, that is something that neuroscience can speak to. And then how do we apply that in the social context, I think, is where we have to take it. And, I brought up this point about funding, which a few of you have mentioned. You just have to think about who funds science, right? And what are they interested in? So National Science Foundation does fund some of this work, but neuroscience generally, is pretty expensive research. And so, it's not as funded as much by the National Science Foundation. It's more funded by NIH. NIH cares about health disparities, but they don't see studying the actual formation and the changing of biases as part of that. And so it's really just sort of the funding mechanisms and the way they come about. But the other point I made about funding is I do think funding these conversations is not a single shot thing. It's, 3 or 4 years of funding small groups to work together and really talk, get to know the science and get to know each other and get to know how this field works and how this field works. I mean, that I have found, I've only gotten funding like that from private foundations, and I have found it invaluable to opening my eyes to how we talk to each other, how I do things that are really useful for you, not sort of some small variation of my science that I think might be useful for you, right? And that type of thing, I think, is also something that the government doesn't generally fund, is these abilities to have lasting conversations and try things out and be creative, the kinds of things that push us to the next level.
Yeah, and I think it's so critical is, in psychology, we say that research is me-search. And so the very notion that people are asking questions that are anchored in their own experiences, even as a young undergrad, and who was represented in their classrooms and whose labs they interned in, and then who they asked for letters of recommendation, and then how is professionalism perceived, and understanding what a culture is within an institution, and how all of that plays into the evaluation of who gets to come in, and even thinking about the level of what is considered meaningful in good science. And so certain questions, I think, are deemed and labeled and assigned as race-oriented questions, and like, oh, that's what they're doing over there, that's because they're that type of researcher, rather than really looking at science in a more inclusive way. And so I think that also has to be thought out and talked about in ways that many times I find people are not comfortable talking about. Many times because people have not had the opportunity to move their jaw, when they get in a room and they recognize these are intentions, they're not ready to really explore the impact of what happens when you have these good intentions, but you don't have the skills, or I would even dare say the courage or the support to really look at what's underneath the surface and what biases are there. Many people, I find, are petrified of being caught out, of saying the wrong thing and being labeled a certain thing. And so they don't even touch their biases. They keep them hidden in a closet, and it's so scary. And then change doesn't happen. And so all of these things, I think, are really critical for us to understand in the brain. But until there are spaces that people can actually talk about this stuff, unpack it, and then make actionable change, you'll continue to see the same cycles over and over again.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dana. I think that our time is up, but I do want to just say that this has been really an example of Lee's vision in founding PSSN. There are so many different angles to work on mind, brain, and behavior from all parts of the university, and that, we've seen it on display here with, the most pressing social issue of our time. So I think that this is a work that's going to continue over years. We'll see you in the classroom. And I just want to thank Valerie, especially for her really exemplary and amazing leading, and to each one of you, to Lee, to Wanda, to Dana, to Liz, and Michael for your really insightful comments. And I want to thank the audience for their interesting and insightful questions. Thank you all so much. And do visit our website, those of you who want to learn more about the many perspectives on neuroscience that we bring.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thank you again.
Thanks, Valerie.